I now began to consider seriously with myself concerning my own case, and how I should dispose of myself, that is to say, whether I should resolve to stay in London, or shut up my house and flee, as many of my neighbours did. I have set this particular down so fully, because I know not but it may be of some moment to those who come after me, if they come to be brought to the same distress, and to the same manner of making their choice, and therefore I desire this account may pass with them, rather for a direction to themselves to act by, than a history of my actings, seeing it may not be of one farthing value to them to note what became of me. I had two important things before me. The one was the carrying on my business and shop, which was considerable, and in which was embarked all my effects in the world, and the other was the preservation of my life in so dismal a calamity, as I saw apparently what was coming down upon the whole city, and which, however great it was, my fears perhaps as well as other people's, represented to be much greater than it could be. It was a very ill time to be sick in, for if any one complained, it was immediately said he had had the plague, and though I had indeed no symptoms of that distemper, yet being very ill, both in my head and in my stomach, I was not without apprehension that I really was infected, but in about 3 days I grew better, and the third night I rested well, sweated a little, and was much refreshed. The apprehensions of its being the infection went also quite away with my illness, and I went about my business as usual. It was now the beginning of August, and the plague grew very violent and terrible in the place where I lived, and Dr. Heath coming to visit me, and finding that I ventured so often out in the streets, earnestly persuaded me to lock up myself and my family, and not to suffer any of us to go out of doors, to keep all our windows fast, shutters and curtains close, and never to open them, but first to make a very strong smoke in the room, where the window or door was to be opened, with rosin and pitch, brimstone or gunpowder and the like, and we did this for some time. But as I had not laid in a store of provision for such a retreat, it was impossible that we could keep within doors entirely. However, I attempted, though it was so very late, to do something towards it. And first, as I had convenience both for brewing and baking, I went and bought 2 sacks of meal, and for several weeks, having an oven, we baked all our own bread. Also I bought malt, and brewed as much beer as all the casks I had would hold, and which seemed enough to serve my house for 5 or 6 weeks. Also I laid in a quantity of salt butter and Cheshire cheese, but I had no flesh meat, and the plague raged so violently among the butchers and slaughterhouses on the other side of our street, where they are known to dwell in great numbers, that it was not advisable so much as to go over the street among them. The poor people could not lay up provisions, and there was a necessity that they must go to market to buy, and others to send servants or their children, and as this was a necessity which renewed itself daily, it brought abundance of unsound people to the markets, and a great many that went thither sound brought death home with them. It is true, people used all possible precaution when they any one bought a joint of meat in the market. They would not take it off of the butcher's hand, but take it off of the hooks themselves. On the other hand, the butcher would not touch the money, but have it put into a pot full of vinegar, which he kept for that purpose. The buyer carried always small money to make up any odd sum, that they might take no change. They carried bottles for cents, and perfumes in their hands, and all the means that could be used were used. But then the poor couldn't do even these things, and they went at all hazards. The face of London was now indeed strangely altered. I mean the whole mass of buildings, city, liberties, suburbs, Westminster, Southwark, and altogether, for as to the particular part called the city, or within the walls, that was not yet much infected, but in the whole the face of things, I say, was much altered. Sorrow and sadness sat upon every face, and though some part were not yet overwhelmed, yet all looked deeply concerned, and as we saw it apparently coming on, so everyone looked on himself and his family as in the utmost danger, were it possible to represent those times exactly to those that did not see them, and give the reader due ideas of the horror that everywhere presented itself, it must make just impressions upon their minds, and fill them with surprise. London might well be said to be all in tears. The mourners did not go about the streets indeed, for nobody put on black, or made a formal dress of mourning for their nearest friends, but the voice of mourning was truly heard in the streets, the shrieks of women and children at the windows and doors of their houses, where their dearest relations were, perhaps dying, or just dead, were so frequent to be heard as we passed the streets that it was enough to pierce the stoutest heart in the world to hear them. Tears and lamentations were seen almost in every house, especially in the first part of the visitation, for towards the latter end men's hearts were hardened, and death was so always before their eyes that they did not much concern themselves for the loss of their friends, expecting that they themselves should be summoned the next hour. I would be glad if I could close the account of this melancholy year with some particular examples historically, I mean of the thankfulness to God our preserver for our being delivered from this dreadful calamity. Certainly the circumstances of the deliverance, as well as the terrible enemy we were delivered from, called upon the whole nation for it. The circumstances of the deliverance were indeed very remarkable, as I have in part mentioned already, and particularly the dreadful condition which we were all in, when we were, to the surprise of the whole town, made joyful with the hope of a stop of the infection. It is impossible to express the change that appeared in the very countenances of the people that Thursday morning when the weekly bill came out. It might have been perceived in their countenances that a secret surprise and smile of joy sat on everybody's face. They shook one another by the hands in the streets, who would hardly go on the same side of the way with one another before. Where the streets were not too broad, they would open their windows and call from one house to another, and asked how they did, and if they had heard the good news, that the plague was abated. Some would return when they said good news, and ask what good news, and when they answered that the plague was abated, and the bills decreased almost 2,000 deaths, they would cry out, God be praised, and would weep aloud for joy, telling them they had heard nothing of it. Such was the joy of the people that it was as it were life to them from the grave. I could set down almost as many extravagant things done in the excess of their joy as of their grief, but that would be to lessen the value of it. It was a common thing to meet people in the street that were strangers and that we knew nothing at all of, expressing their surprise, going one day through Aldgate, and a pretty many people being passing and repassing, there comes a man out of the end of the Minories, and looking up a little the street and down, he throws his hands abroad. Lord, what an alteration is here! Why, last week I came along here, and hardly anybody was to be seen. Another man, I heard him, adds to his words, 'Tis all wonderful, 'tis all a dream. Blessed be God, says a third man, and let us give thanks to him, for 'tis all his own doing. Human help and human skill was at an end. These were all strangers to one another, but such salutations as these were frequent in the street every day, and in spite of a loose behavior, the very common people went along the streets, giving God thanks for their deliverance.